Durant 3 jours, nous allons aborder un sujet particulier, l'importance de l'éducation de qualité pour la petite enfance en Afrique. Et nos échanges vont bâtir sur les expériences et le savoir porté par les délégations nationales africaines ici présentes. Merci à toutes les délégations de pays, et je cite par ordre alphabétique, le Burkina Faso, le Cap-Vert, la Côte d'Ivoire, l'Éthiopie, le Ghana, la Guinée, le Kenya, le Sénégal, le Sierra Leone, la Tunisie et l'Ouganda. Merci aussi à toutes nos expertes, à tous nos experts qui viennent des 4 continents d'Afrique, d'Amérique, d'Europe et d'Asie. Merci et bienvenue à tous nos partenaires ici présents et à tous les participants. Durant ces sessions inaugurales, après les allocutions d'ouverture de Monsieur le ministre marocain de l'Éducation nationale, du préscolaire et des sports et de Monsieur le représentant de l'UNICEF, nous allons assister à 2 sessions plénières qui vont aborder 2 sujets qui vont donner le temps de cette conférence. Le premier sujet va aborder le développement cognitif, affectif et la socialisation des enfants. Le second va établir l'état des lieux, les défis, les enjeux, mais également les opportunités pour une éducation de qualité pour la petite enfance en Afrique. J'ai l'honneur, mesdames et messieurs, d'inviter à l'estrade pour son allocution d'ouverture, Monsieur le ministre marocain, Monsieur Mohamed Saad Barrada, ministre de l'Éducation nationale, du préscolaire et des sports. Je vous en prie, Monsieur le ministre.
Monsieur le Wali, Messieurs les présidents des fondations, Messieurs les secrétaires généraux, Messieurs les représentants des organisations des Nations Unies au Maroc, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers invités. C'est avec un immense plaisir que je m'adresse à vous à l'occasion de l'ouverture de cette conférence internationale de coopération Sud-Sud sur le développement de la petite enfance. Notre rencontre aujourd'hui traduit la plus haute importance que nous attachons tous au chantier de développement et de la généralisation de l'enseignement préscolaire. Si nous sommes réunis ici, représentants de gouvernements, d'organisations internationales, experts et acteurs de la société civile, cela reste bien entendu dû à notre conviction partagée que l'enseignement préscolaire constitue le socle sur lequel repose l'avenir de nos sociétés, tant il joue un rôle déterminant dans le développement harmonieux des enfants, influençant leur épanouissement cognitif, social et émotionnel. En effet, et au vu de toutes les découvertes récentes en neurosciences et en sciences de l'éducation, la période préscolaire représente la fondation de l'école et une fenêtre exceptionnelle à exploiter pour donner le meilleur départ aux enfants dans la vie. Dans cette perspective, il va sans dire qu'investir dans l'éducation de la petite enfance et l'enseignement préscolaire, c'est investir dans l'avenir de nos nations et de notre continent. À cet égard, l'éducation préscolaire revêt une importance hautement stratégique dans la mesure où elle produit un double effet structurant chez l'enfant. Le premier étant un effet concomitant au déroulement du cycle d'éducation et le second étant un effet produit dans la durée et sur un terme plus long. Les effets immédiats de l'éducation préscolaire chez l'enfant tiennent au fait que ce cycle participe tout d'abord au développement cognitif des enfants en leur permettant d'apprendre les bases du langage, des mathématiques et de la lecture. Ensuite, à leur socialisation en encourageant le développement des compétences relationnelles et l'incubation du sens du partage et de la coopération, à l'épanouissement personnel en favorisant la confiance en soi et l'autonomie, et enfin, à la préparation à l'école primaire, puisqu'il est amplement démontré que les enfants ayant été préscolarisés sont mieux préparés pour affronter les défis scolaires. À plus long terme, il est ensuite largement reconnu que l'enseignement préscolaire est un gage de réussite scolaire, d'intégration sociale, de développement émotionnel et d'égalité des chances. À cet égard, il n'est pas inutile de rappeler que les experts sont unanimes pour considérer que les enfants préscolarisés obtiennent de meilleurs résultats, qu'ils développent des compétences sociales et relationnelles élevées et qu'ils apprennent à gérer leurs émotions et à développer de l'empathie. Une autre vertu attachée à l'éducation de la petite enfance, et qui n'est pas la moindre, est que le préscolaire contribue à la réduction des inégalités sociales. C'est donc partant des vertus universellement reconnues à l'enseignement préscolaire que le Royaume du Maroc, sur haute orientation de Sa Majesté le roi Mohammed VI, que Dieu le glorifie, a érigé le chantier de l'éducation nationale de la petite enfance au rang de priorité nationale. En lançant dès l'année 2018 le programme national de généralisation et de développement de l'enseignement préscolaire, Sa Majesté le Roi a impulsé une dynamique de prise en charge éducative massive et inclusive qui, à ce jour, permet à près d'1 million d'enfants de bénéficier d'un programme d'éducation préscolaire de qualité, ce qui représente un taux de généralisation de plus de 80%. Au Maroc, le ministère de l'Éducation nationale, qui est le régulateur et le principal financeur du secteur du préscolaire, porte la stratégie dans ce domaine, pilote sa mise en œuvre et demeure le garant du modèle pédagogique qui doit assurer la continuité avec le primaire. Le ministère établit également tous les référentiels de qualité nécessaires pour unifier les standards, suivre l'implémentation et évaluer la performance globale. Sur le terrain opérationnel, le ministère pilote le préscolaire en s'appuyant sur de solides partenaires, à l'instar de l'Initiative nationale pour le développement humain, qui s'est notamment engagée dès 2018 à construire 10 000 unités préscolaires en privilégiant le milieu rural ainsi qu'à prendre en charge le fonctionnement des classes ouvertes pendant leurs 2 premières années de leur existence. Le ministère de l'Éducation nationale s'appuie par ailleurs sur des acteurs associatifs de référence qui ont joué un rôle pionnier et accumulé une riche expérience sur le terrain. Véritables délégateurs de missions de service public, ces structures associatives, au premier rang desquelles l'on peut citer la Fondation marocaine pour la promotion de l'enseignement préscolaire et la Fondation Zakoura pour l'éducation, ont en effet été au cœur de l'action pour dessiner et déployer jusque dans les territoires les plus reculés du Royaume, le modèle national d'éducation préscolaire. De par le soin qu'elles ont apporté à la définition des programmes, ainsi qu'au recrutement, à la formation et au suivi des membres des équipes pédagogiques, il convient ici de rappeler combien ces associations ont fortement participé à la construction, au niveau national, d'un système éducatif dédié à la petite enfance de qualité. Les actions engagées par le Royaume du Maroc dans le domaine de l'éducation préscolaire s'inscrivent dans le cadre fixé par la doctrine panafricaine dans le domaine inscrite dans la déclaration de Rabat, qui a conclu les travaux de la conférence internationale sur le développement de la petite enfance tenue à Rabat du 7 au 9 septembre 2016. Cette doctrine considère notamment que l'enseignement préscolaire constitue une priorité stratégique pour les nations africaines. Dans ce contexte, la conférence organisée aujourd'hui au Maroc vise à renforcer l'engagement des pays africains en faveur d'un enseignement préscolaire de qualité, en harmonie avec l'objectif de développement durable 4, l'agenda 2063 et la stratégie continentale pour l'éducation en Afrique, CESA. Permettez-moi de saisir l'occasion qui m'est fournie dans le cadre de cette manifestation pour rappeler combien, Conformément à la vision éclairée de Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI, le Maroc a justement fait de la coopération Sud-Sud un levier stratégique de sa politique étrangère. Il se trouve que cette approche qui a été consacrée parmi les constantes diplomatiques de notre pays vise, entre autres, le renforcement des capacités dans les domaines du développement humain. Dans ce contexte, cette conférence représente donc un rendez-vous idoine pour que nous échangions au sujet de l'éducation de la petite enfance, les meilleures de nos pratiques, et pour que nous imaginions des solutions innovantes à même de nous aider à relever les défis auxquels nous pouvons être confrontés. À cet égard, le Maroc ambitionne de voir les travaux de cette conférence se conclure par des recommandations fondatrices et porteuses d'espoir pour les populations de notre continent d'une manière générale et de manière plus particulière pour les tranches les plus jeunes de ces populations. Pour conclure, permettez-moi d'exprimer ma sincère gratitude à l'UNICEF pour son soutien permanent en faveur de l'enfance. Grâce à son appui, est-il nécessaire de le rappeler, elle a facilité la conception puis le déploiement de solutions adaptées aux défis spécifiques de l'enseignement préscolaire sur notre continent, réaffirmant à chaque fois l'importance stratégique de l'éducation de la petite enfance en tant que levier clé pour le développement humain, social et économique en Afrique. Nos remerciements valent également pour tous les acteurs ayant porté leur contribution pour que les travaux de cette conférence soient couronnés de succès. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, pour votre leadership. Merci d'avoir rappelé la vision stratégique derrière l'organisation de cette conférence internationale de coopération Sud-Sud et sa contribution à la réalisation de la stratégie continentale d'éducation en Afrique. L'Afrique a un partenaire, comme l'a indiqué bien Monsieur le Ministre, de référence pour la promotion des droits des enfants sur le continent, l'UNICEF, le Fonds des Nations Unies pour l'enfance. Et j'ai l'immense plaisir d'inviter pour l'allocution d'ouverture Monsieur le représentant de l'UNICEF au Maroc, Monsieur Marc Vincent. Je vous en prie.
Monsieur le ministre d'Éducation nationale, du préscolaire et des sports, Monsieur le Wali de INDH, Messieurs les présidents des fondations, les secrétaires généraux, Messieurs les représentants et Mesdames les représentants des organisations des Nations Unies au Maroc, Madame et Messieurs les représentants de le corps diplomatique, chers participants, chères délégations de plusieurs pays, Madame la ministre secrétaire générale de Éthiopie, chers membres de médias, salam alaikum. Permettez-moi de faire mon discours en anglais pour aussi refléter un peu la caractéristique continentale de cette conférence. It is with great pleasure for me to welcome you to Rabat today and an honor to address you on behalf of UNICEF. Together with our partners in the government of Morocco, and particularly the Ministry of National Education, Preschool and Sports, we are pleased to open this second international conference on South-South cooperation on early childhood development. The fact that it falls on the eve of the International Day of Education only underscores the importance of our deliberations for Africa's children. As already explained and mentioned by Monsieur le Ministre, early childhood development is a subject that appeals both to our hearts and to our minds. In recent years, we have all been captivated by the science that demonstrates how critical this period is to each and every child. As you well know, it is a period of rapid development of the brain where the evolving capacity to communicate, to play, to learn from the earliest moments of life is truly remarkable. Shortly, our first panel will remind us of the rich potential and how we can leverage this window of opportunity for the benefit of children and for countries at large. UNICEF has distilled this science to advocate for ECD programs that are comprehensive and promote multiple domains of care. We know that by assuring the health and nutrition, security and safety of a child with responsive caregiving and optimal learning, we can trigger not only the best start to a life for a child, but also, importantly, the key ingredients that will nurture a lifetime of improved learning. This, in turn, can lead to greater employment potential, increased social cohesion, and better development outcomes. The first conference, hosted by Morocco in 2016, culminated in the Rabat Declaration. Among the conclusions, participants committed to promote multi-sectoral public policies on early childhood development. The declaration gave due focus to the most vulnerable of children and highlighted the importance of sustainable financing, a well-trained workforce able to bring into reality those public policies. This commitment remains ever relevant. By 2050, Africa will be home to 1 billion children and adolescents. Last year, during the Day of the Africa Child, UNICEF highlighted that only 27% of children attend preschool education, and 9 out of 10 children in sub-Saharan Africa cannot read or understand a simple text by age 10. The learning crisis that faces us is known to all. Today, governments in Africa are currently spending around 2% of their education budgets on pre-primary education, in comparison to 20% that goes towards higher education. Over the course of the next few days, we will focus on one of the essential domains of early childhood development, early learning. The audience is aware of the global learning crisis that I have just mentioned, which was exacerbated by the impact of COVID-19. Mitigating and reversing those learning losses begins in the earliest years. And that effort must be powered by evidence-based approaches on how best to engage with children, with their families, and adapted to each country context. Early learning is the work of everyone. Governments, families, and service providers. This community of practice, of practitioners and policymakers here today, you are the ones that set the standards, design the policies, and set budgets. Your role is critical, and your deliberations over the next 3 days is equally critical. Of course, each country has its own national framework, governance modalities, successes, and challenges. I am delighted that our partners in Morocco will share with you their own journey. As you know, in 2018, Morocco, through royal directive, called for the generalization of preschool education. Since then, nearly 80%, as highlighted by the Minister, are able to access preschool, thanks not only to the political engagement of the Kingdom, but also the consistent allocation of domestic funding. Equally, our partners in Morocco are ready to hear from you, your experience and lessons as they double down on reaching truly universal coverage and that last mile, which we all know is the most difficult. I'll conclude by acknowledging the important characteristics of this conference, a characteristic that extends from the first conference nearly 10 years ago, which is, of course, the partnership among African countries. I wish to sincerely thank the 11 delegations from across the continent here today. Your tremendous technical knowledge and examples will enrich our discussions. This network focuses innovation and knowledge on delivering quality early learning programs at scale. UNICEF as an organization reiterates its commitment to accompany Africa in its development and education agenda, that this conference and the solutions it highlights will contribute to that effort. Thank you to all our organizers, again, particularly to the Ministry of Education, to all of the experts for their insights and their bodies of knowledge that they will present, to all our partners here in Morocco for your unwavering commitment to making quality early learning attainable for each child. It is without a doubt that we ensure our investments in early childhood development are worthy of this continent's greatest promise, its children. Shukran.
Merci, Monsieur le représentant de l'UNICEF. Merci d'avoir réaffirmé l'engagement de votre organisation à accompagner les efforts d'éducation de qualité pour la petite enfance et de soutenir les efforts de coopération sud-sud. Mesdames et messieurs, al-lahadat al-oula muhimma. Les premiers moments comptent. Early moments matter. Et la vidéo que nous allons voir tout de suite va nous rappeler l'importance cruciale des premiers jours, des premières années de chaque être humain.
A child's first steps, first words, the first attempt to mimic a caregiver's gestures, to draw a picture or to write a word. These are important milestones on a child's journey to realizing his or her full potential and magical moments for anyone watching. But to achieve these, children need an enabling and supportive environment in which to grow, learn, and thrive. Early moments matter. The best possible combination of nutrition, protection, and stimulation is critical for optimal brain development. It also creates the conditions for health, happiness, and progress throughout childhood and beyond. Solid early development stays with children as they advance into adulthood. It prepares them to help their families, their communities, and their countries. Confronted with compelling evidence and sustained advocacy, the world has come to recognize that investing in early childhood development is an essential component of national and global prosperity. In 2015, early childhood development was included in the Sustainable Development Goals in recognition of its importance in eradicating poverty and hunger, promoting healthy lives, reducing inequality, fostering economic growth, and building peaceful societies.
Nous allons continuer l'exploration des aspects mis en évidence par cette vidéo avec le premier panel en plénière qui va traiter du sujet du développement cognitif, affectif et de la socialisation de la petite enfance. Et j'ai l'immense plaisir d'inviter à l'estrade M. Rafael Pérez Escamilla, professeur de santé publique à l'école santé publique de Yale, des États-Unis. Je vous en prie. Madame Catherine Draper, professeure associée à l'université de Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. Bienvenue. Madame Amanda De Vercelli, spécialiste principale en éducation, Global Lead pour la petite enfance à la Banque mondiale. Et en ligne avec nous, Madame Erina Dia, directrice associée au développement de la petite enfance à l'UNICEF. Cette séance sera modérée par Madame Nassim Aoul, représentante adjointe de l'UNICEF au Maroc. Je vous souhaite de bons travaux et de bons échanges. Merci.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be moderating our first session. This morning, or this afternoon rather, we heard two speeches by their excellencies that helped to frame our discussions over the next 2 days. Before we discuss how to advance in terms of early childhood education across the African continent, we'll take a pause and consider why. This morning, many of you were able to visit how Morocco has taken its own journey in expanding early childhood education. Now we have the great pleasure to be accompanied by three experts who have spent many years thinking through some of these topics, and it is with their support that we will go through the foundations of why we are here. They will help us to understand why integrated early childhood development programs are crucial, emphasis on the word integrated. They will help us to understand how the first window of opportunity is indeed the first 1,000 days. And from there online, we will have a discussion about what we need to do to sustain this investment by ensuring early learning is sustained through our commitments that we have made across the SDGs. And lastly, we'll look at why these dividends of investing in early education are so high. And we'll also spend some time thinking about why the cost of inaction is even higher. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rafael Perez Escamilla. Dr. Rafael is a tenured professor of public health in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences and a director of the Office of Public Health Practice and the Global Health Concentration and the Maternal Child Health Promotion Program at Yale. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed research articles, and he was a co-author of both the 2016 Lancet Early Childhood Development Series and the 2023 Lancet Breastfeeding Series. He served as an advisor to many, including UNICEF, the WHO, FAO, the Bank, and USAID. So Rafael, without further ado, if I can hand over to you for 15 minutes in letting us think through what it means to put in place integrated early childhood development programs as a start before we delve into early learning, and what lessons we've learned over time. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your kind introduction, and thank you very much to the government and the people of Morocco for your trust and for warmly welcoming me in your most beautiful country. And thank you very, very much to all my colleagues from Morocco's UNICEF office. I'm the biggest fan of UNICEF. I think UNICEF rocks, and the leadership that they have shown globally in the early childhood development field is second to none. So I will talk to you about the scientific evidence that continues to mesmerize us in terms as to what happens during the first 1,000 days and the next 1,000 days, as we will hear from Catherine today, that explains why the investments in nurturing care for early childhood development are so crucial. When a mother during gestation receives love, receives support, receives adequate nourishment, and receives adequate high-quality healthcare, she's expected to deliver a healthy baby. Upon delivery, that baby is going to have about 250 billion neurons in their brain. The number is unimaginably high, so as a comparison, I want to share with you that 250 billion is roughly the same amount as the total number of stars in our universe. Immediately after birth, the baby, through exploring the environment, early stimulation, and experiencing many, many different activities and feelings, start connecting these neurons in a process known as synaptogenesis, that the synapses really represent the different pathways that the brain needs to follow to execute or implement the functions that are essentially for child development. The speed at which the synapses develop during the first 2 to 3 years of life is unmatchable at any other point in the life course. As a result, during the first 3 to 5 years of life, children develop trillions and trillions of synapses. These synapses indeed is what is needed for children to develop the skills that are needed for them to learn properly and to be able to develop all the motor, all the sensory, and all the cognitive skills, including language development, number understanding development, and so on, that are going to be crucial for their social, for their emotional, and for their cognitive development for the rest of their lives. As you can see from this graph, it is a scaffolding process that is completely underlined and driven by the process of synaptogenesis that results from giving access to children to explore their environments and learn from them in a safe environment. We also know now very clearly that during the first 1,000 days of life, 0 to 2, even 0 to 3 years of age, the magical process of the development of flavor preferences for foods develops. So what the mother eats during gestation, those flavors are going to be transferred through the amniotic fluid to the fetus. What the mother eats during breastfeeding, those flavors are also going to be transferred to their babies. And the diversity and quality of the diet that the babies eat once they are introduced to complementary foods at around 6 months, with a goal of having them eat the family food by 1 year and to completely eat it in the same form as the rest of the family by 2 years, is going to be a very powerful determinant of the dietary preferences for the rest of their lives. We oftentimes don't talk about this science, but it is incredibly important when it comes to understanding why it is so important to protect children and families from the marketing of the junk food industry, the ultra-processed food industry, including the sugar-sweetened beverages industry. And this is why nurturing care is so incredibly important. We have learned with very strong backup basic science from the neuroscience field that for children to develop properly since the very beginning of life, they need to be offered simultaneously in a multi-sectoral, very well-coordinated way, each of the petals of the flower that nurturing care is, with the children and their families always being at the center of our investments and programming efforts. Obviously, the children and their families need access, universal access to high-quality healthcare. They need constantly to have food and nutrition security. You can imagine the nutrient requirements that these babies have to be able to develop billions of trillions of synapses and billions of neurons, and to grow at the speed at which they grow. And how important this proper nutrition is for the development of their immune systems. If children are sick, they are not going to be able to learn. They are not going to be able to develop well psycho-emotionally. They also need to have access to responsive parenting, and it is music to my ears to have learned this morning and now how much effort and resources are being invested through the government of Morocco to address responsive caregiving, not only at home, but also through the early care, childcare and education centers. The fourth petal has to do with the right that children and their families have to live in healthy, clean, secure communities with low crime rates, with safe green areas, where everybody comes together to protect infants and young children and their family members against all forms of violence. The brain, when it comes to how it's injured, does not distinguish between a child receiving a slap or a child receiving an insult, a demeaning comment, or a child being psycho-emotionally neglected. They all end up destroying very important regions from the brain. And last but not least, of course, we're here because we all want to ensure that all the children have access to early stimulation since the beginning of life and opportunities from early learning. And we're now recommending not only to start in preschool, but also from 0 to 3 years of age, as, for example, the government of Mexico is now doing through its official new program developed by the Ministry of Education based on the nurturing care principles. It is very important for all of us to remember that the state, society as a whole, has a very big responsibility for all families, no matter the social class in which the babies are born, to have access to food security, nutrition security, health security, protection against all forms of violence, and so on, because the absence of any of these petals from the flower of nurturing care destabilizes the family environments, destabilizes the communities, making it impossible to meet the requirement that nurturing care needs to have stable environments surrounding the children. We know that obviously the investments in early childhood development in any way, shape, or form should stop at 2 years of age. Of course, they should continue throughout the life course, especially the next 1,000 days of life, 2 to 5 years of age. And the reason is, if we don't invest in the first 1,000 days of life, is that we are going to really not getting, as a country, the return of investment that we could have gotten had we invested since the beginning of life. The brain has the capacity to change, has a capacity to improve, but the longer it takes to start investing in nurturing care, child and human development, the more difficult it is going to be to recover the function that has been lost. So as an example, you can see on your right-hand side how the regions of the brain that regulate psycho-emotional development and the development of higher cognitive functions gets totally decimated, totally shut down when children, this is the brain of a 2-year-old orphan that was abandoned in an orphanatory where the child was not even touched. Essentially was placed in a crib like if it was a little animal that was not even held when he was fed. And on the left, you can see how those same areas and the rest of the brain light up like Manhattan at night when a comparison child who had received nurturing care, when the PET scan shows the regions of the brain that light up in that child. So this is the type of irreversible damage, especially with regards to psycho-emotional development, that basic science, basic neuroscience, even has shown us now the pictures of what happens to the brain. So let's make sure that we continue translating this science into large-scale, effective, well-coordinated, multi-sectoral programs. I want to close up by saying that obviously it's not only the brain development that is very important to think about when we talk about the impact of nurturing care, but we also know that when it comes to motor development, to physical growth, the incredible speed of growth in the early life illustrates why the window of opportunity during the first 1,000 days of life, and to some extent also the next 1,000 days of life, needs to be very much attended to through very strong healthcare and food and nutrition security programs in the countries. We now know also very well that the metabolic alterations that increase the risk significantly of human beings of developing obesity and non-communicable diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and certain types of cancer later on in life get established very early on during the first 1,000 days of life, and again to some extent the next 1,000 days of life. And this is because the exposure of our genes to unhealthy foods like ultra-processed foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, to stress and any other toxic adverse experiences end up pre-programming the organism to develop these vulnerabilities that are incredibly costly, painful for the family, for the individual, but also that are breaking down the capacity of healthcare systems to deal at the same time with this curative health that we're trying to invest much more on primary and secondary prevention services. So this is why we now use the term the primordial prevention of disease. Not only the primary, but the primordial needs to start since the beginning of life, and it has to be assessed also as a potential impact of the nurturing care investments. Very rapidly, the obesity pandemic, my team and others have shown that has been incredibly difficult to bring under control because it gets transmitted from one generation to the next. So when the parents of the child are overweight or obese, when they conceive the baby, that in and by itself increases the risk that the child is going to be born with a vulnerability to obesity and NCDs later on in life, especially if the babies don't receive optimal nutrition during the first 1,000 days of life. And when they become adolescents, if they are overweight or obese, there is a 70% chance that they are going to remain overweight or obese by the time they conceive the babies for the next generation. And the risk is compounded if the mothers gain more than what they should be gaining during gestation. So the prevention, the primordial prevention of obesity needs to happen even before the babies are conceived, what we call preconceptional health or preconceptional nutrition. So in summary, a genetic blueprint in the embryo or the fetus establishes the broad strokes of development, but the environment, including nutrition, exposure to adverse toxic experiences since the beginning of life, really is what ends up setting the blueprint that is going to determine whether the kids are going to develop or not obesity and NCDs later on in life. So there is no doubt that nurturing care has to be family-centered and has to be done through a life course approach that attends to both the health of the mother and the health of the father, and this is physical and mental health. So this is a summary of one of the most important recommendations that came out from the 2016 Lancet Early Childhood Development Series on why we cannot only just claim victory because we are investing in the 0 to 5 period of life, but we need to continue investing in the equivalent of nurturing care, again, during the school years, adolescence, and even towards the end of life with older adults. So, to conclude, our adequate nurturing care during the first 1,000 days and the next 1,000 days is crucial for human and national development because it provides essential building blocks for proper brain development, healthy growth, and a strong immune system. It also fosters the child's ability to grow, learn, and thrive, and it really benefits a longer-term human development, national development, and the evidence is very clear now that if we still want to have a planet to live in a few generations from now, we better triple or quadruple our efforts at which we're moving forward as nations investing and implementing effectively nurturing care programs. Thank you very, very much, and as the Canadian author that composes music for kids reminds us, if we can change the beginning of the story, we can change the whole story. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perez. I think that was really helpful just to show again what the stakes are and to show how important this period of time is. And in fact, to take us a step back and to realize that a lot of this investment starts as early as investing in the health of the mother, pregnancy, and continuing with the life cycle approach. Thank you also for reminding us of how tremendous the brain development and the rapid pace of that development is, and how much easier it is to invest in those early windows rather than to play catch up throughout the child's life and then continuing a generational deficits that are much harder to counter. So thank you very much for that. We'll move swiftly on to our next speaker, Dr. Catherine Draper. She joins us as Associate Professor from Wits University in South Africa. She has a background in psychology, public health, and qualitative research. She's passionate about early childhood development and the next 1,000 days. And she's also led the 2023 Lancet series on early childhood development. She's currently leading studies on early learning, social emotional development, and mental health in young children, particularly in vulnerable settings in South Africa. She will take us through the next 1,000 days and how important that foundation is for early learning, particularly in low and middle income countries. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dr. Draper.
Good afternoon. Warm welcome from South Africa, and thank you very much for the hospitality and the welcome we've received from everyone in Morocco so far. So I'm going to jump straight in and talk about our latest Lancet series, which picks up very nicely from what Professor Perez Escamilla was presenting, and we're looking at the next 1,000 days. This may be a new term for many of you, and as he highlighted, we're referring to the years of 2 to 5 of a child's life following the first 1,000 days. And I'm going to very briefly take you through the 2 papers of the series. The first really setting up why this is important, and secondly, setting up the economic case for investing. And what we really want to emphasize is that the next 1,000 days is not about competing with the first 1,000 days. It's not about arguing which is more important, but it's about building on the incredibly important early investments from the first 1,000 days and continuing that through the stages of the life course. So why do the next 1,000 days matter? So we have the evidence to show that this is a critical window for the significant growth of a range of skills. It's an opportunity to mitigate various environmental risks, promote protective factors, and establish healthy behavioral and developmental trajectories. And we believe the evidence shows that it's a chance to sustain and build on gains made in the first 1,000 days and hopefully recalibrate trajectories where opportunities were lost in the previous 1,000 days. And the nurturing care framework continues to shape our thinking about what children need to thrive in this period. And we really want and have tried in this series to emphasize the comprehensive, multi-sectoral and multi-level life course perspective and provide enabling environments and development that are cumulative and continuous. And so as this figure shows from the paper is that there's these key developmental domains in the next 1,000 days, including cognitive, social, emotional, and motor skills. And obviously development in these domains begins in the first 1,000 days, but the increasing maturing of neural networks that were pointed out in the previous presentation contributes to this rapid growth of skills in these domains in the next 1,000 days. And young children's development of these skills is also influenced by their growing sense of autonomy as they get older, as well as their expanding relationships in the next 1,000 days. And so as part of this paper, a set of reviews were conducted on the various environments that shape children's development in the next 1,000 days. Obviously, the findings of the reviews are discussed in extensive detail in the paper, but I really just want to highlight some of the key takeaways from the reviews. So firstly, in terms of building on parenting investments from the first to the next 1,000 days, there are a number of gaps that needs to be closed. This include the prevention of violence against children, father-inclusive strategies, caregiver and child mental health, and children's social-emotional development. Importantly, these reviews show that we need to emphasize access, equity, and particularly quality of care, of care and early learning outside of the home, and that these really matter. We need to advance multi-sector actions, and we need to pay more attention to children with disabilities, as well as to the impact of climate change and pollution around the globe. So in addition to these reviews, we also report on estimates of young children's access to nurturing care and development in the next 1,000 days. So firstly, a multi-dimensional index of nurturing care in the next 1,000 days was developed that includes indices of nurturing care dimensions appropriate for this age group, as shown in this graph. And obviously any index we developed was going to be imperfect, but we feel that these indicators were the best possible approach given the evidence available. And so adequate nurturing care was defined as having access to at least one indicator of each of the 5 dimensions of nurturing care. And the key finding from these analyses was that only 1 in 4 children 3 to 4 years old are receiving adequate nurturing care in low and middle income countries. Also, there were vast geographical differences in the proportion of children receiving this adequate nurturing care, with just under 6% of children from low-income countries receiving this care. And really importantly, these data are not intended to blame caregivers for not providing nurturing care, and it's really critical that we understand the structural barriers and the multiple factors that influence caregivers' ability to provide the care that children need to thrive. A second set of analyses drew on data from Save the Children's International Development and Early Learning Assessment with a sample of more than 18,000 3 to 7-year-olds in low and middle income countries. As this graph shows, positive associations were identified between indicators of early learning and responsive care and multiple child development outcomes. Furthermore, we showed that by age 5, children who had received early learning support and responsive care are approximately 2 years ahead in their development. Thirdly, we conducted a mapping review of interventions promoting development in the next 1,000 days, published between 1990 and 2020, over 70,000 papers. And, 70,000 captured in the review, and close to 900 included. And interventions promoting healthy development in the next 1,000 days are predominantly delivered in high-income, westernized countries, with only 5% of published interventions having been implemented in low-income or low-middle-income countries. And what these findings really do is highlight the mismatch between the global regions where interventions are most needed, based on the previous evidence I presented, and the areas where interventions are being implemented, evaluated, and published. And this trend of dominance of research from high-income Western countries is prevalent in child development research more generally, and although it's increasingly being acknowledged, there is much work to still be done to ensure that the minority of the world's population of children is not used as the benchmark for children all around the world. And this is why conferences such as this are so important. So from the mapping review, our key recommendations for interventions were again highlighting many of the similar gaps in interventions in the next 1,000 days to address parenting, family mental health, violence protection, and nutrition. And early childhood care and education settings offer a protective environment for promoting development. And this really links to the need to shift from positioning interventions largely within health platforms, which makes the most sense in the first 1,000 days, but also a shift in stakeholders from predominantly the health sector to the education sector in the next 1,000 days. Lastly, these findings point to the importance of transitions in both systems and interventions, as well as developmental outcomes and risks as children move from the first to the next 1,000 days. And we need to understand these differences, but also apply a life course perspective in understanding how these transitions can be best navigated. So, and then very briefly, I want to just cover on some of the key points from the second paper about the cost of not investing in the next 1,000 days. So this paper covered intervention studies around cash transfers, ECCE, nutritional interventions, parent interventions, and multi-component interventions. So, whoops, how do we go back? Okay, so we did a comprehensive review of 100 studies across the globe highlighting patterns of child outcomes from interventions across various developmental domains. And we found as well to note the huge range in global participation in early childhood care and education, with a massive need to increase participation rates in Africa. Oh, I've done it again. Sorry, how do I go back? Good. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we found that there were large impacts for ECC programs and parenting programs. The effect was more moderate for cash transfers and for nutritional programs, and also for multi-component programs, but larger for when ECCE and nutrition programs were combined. And in terms of the economic case, so we calculated child, cohort, and country-specific costs of providing at least 1 year of ECCE to all children, and again emphasizing quality. So this assumed a full-day program, a pupil-teacher ratio of 30:2 with a qualified teacher and assistant, public sector wages, and primarily targeting children older than 3 years. And at the national level, the resulting cost would correspond to less than 1% of GDP across different income categories. So in conclusion, our key messages are that the next 1,000 days are a key period for children's development. We have robust evidence that highlights short-term and long-term benefits of interventions in the next 1,000 days. High-quality ECCE programs can improve these outcomes, and other types of programs can also contribute positively to these child development outcomes. But we know that access remains low, and this needs to be addressed, particularly in low-income countries, and that providing what is needed is less than 1% of GDP, and the benefits far outweigh the costs. The benefits of providing this 1 year of ECC to all children on average 8 to 19 times larger than the cost of implementing these in low and middle income countries. An investment in this age group in the next 1,000 days can help country achieve the ambitious SDG targets that were mentioned for health, education, and equity. And ultimately, this investment makes a significant difference in the lives of children, of families, of communities, and nations. And the time to invest is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Draper, and what a nice follow-up from the last intervention. This is probably one of the pieces that was a bit new in terms of looking at the next 1,000 days, with emphasis on parenting, layering interventions around early learning, nutrition, and how indeed the best moment to act is those first 1,000 days, but there is equally potential in the next 1,000 days for the investments we talked about for later. So thank you very much for that, and particularly for calling on countries in this room to be part of the countries that are documenting and sharing and publishing and evaluating their experiences, which is clearly a void in the general body of knowledge. So thank you very much for that. We'll now go to an online intervention from Dr. Irina Dia. She's our global lead for ECD at UNICEF. Dr. Dia previously worked as Chief of Education in Burkina Faso, the DRC, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and before joining UNICEF, held positions with the African Development Bank, working with countries on social transformation through improved access to education, skills, and technology. She's co-authored several papers and journal articles and focuses on parenting, education challenges, and opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Irina, I know you wanted very much to be with us today, but thank you for joining us online. If we can hear from you now on what we need to do and why we need to do it as member states, and reminding us of the commitments we've all taken as countries around the room. Over to you.
Can you see the screen?
We don't see the screen, but we hear you.
You hear you, but you don't see the screen. Okay,
yes.
Let me share. Okay.
While we catch up, maybe in the interest of time, we can get started, and then we'll hopefully be able to project your slides as well.
Just give us one.
Oh.
All
it's
right.
on behind
So,
we couldn't see on the screen.
Can you hear me?
It is, yes, it's projected and we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Excellencies, distinguished guests, good afternoon. As you said, I would have loved to be with you today, but unfortunately I was not able to make it because of prior family commitments, but it's really a great honor to be with you today. And before going any further, I would like also to thank Raphael, because half of my presentation has been done, given that he's been able to talk about the nurturing care framework. So I'm not going to be saying much more about that, but just to say that my intervention is going to be looking, putting early childhood education within that general framework, nurturing care framework that has already been presented. So maybe just quickly to start by saying that it's already been mentioned, quality early childhood development is the foundation. It's going to allow children to develop, grow, reach their full potential. It's a critical period because the brain is extremely elastic during that, elastic and plastic during that period. The synapses are connected at an incredible space. So basically the foundation for learning and development. But maybe other messages that I would like to bring out of what has already been said is like the fact that we also want to emphasize that not only the brain is important, but also the physical body is important. So we need to nurture both the physical and the physical body and the brain, hence the importance of adequate nutrition. But beyond adequate nutrition, we also have good health and all these other elements that Professor Raphael mentioned, interrelated. We all need to work on this at once in order for the child to be able to grow. Why? Because a sick child cannot attend school, or a child that is going to school hungry will be having a hard time focusing in school, etc. We want to make sure that the child is also not exposed to prolonged stress or toxic stress, because we also know that it's going to be having an adverse impact on its ability to develop over the long term. Another thing that we've been saying is also the fact that investments in early childhood development are really cost effective. They have long and short-term impacts, They are essential to building human capital. But what we also need to remember, and that's as important and we don't say much, is that we need to invest as soon as possible. And as you can see from the chart in the right, is really investments in early learning and pre-primary education are actually bound to have higher returns than investment later in the education system. I hope I'm doing this right. Sorry, I'm not technology savvy, so okay, next slide. Okay, so and what you can also say about early childhood education, and early learning is the fact that we are in a favorable context, in the sense that for the first time, we have a global agenda, the SDGs, that recognizes and embraces early child development as central to the achievement of many other goals, including ending poverty, inequality, and also ensuring prosperity and peace. And Target 4.2 specifically conveys that clear objective that all children, boys and girls, must have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education, so that they are ready for school. And for that to be achieved, of course, it means that we need to have substantial investments in early learning and education. Now, if you look at the trends, the recent trends, we need to acknowledge that has been progress, right? Since 2000, the global under 5 mortality rate has declined more than half, and the prevalence of children under 5 with stunted growth due to undernutrition has declined by a third. But there are also challenges that are persisting, lack of opportunities that endanger the futures of the millions of children around the world, with only 60% of them being developmentally on track in health, learning, and psychosocial well-being, SDG 4.2.1. In other words, we have so many children out there that experience multiple and mutually reinforcing deprivations, including extreme poverty, poor access to essential services, lack of access to early stimulation, responsive care, it's been mentioned, and many of those are also left behind by humanitarian crises. Now, in response, UNICEF has developed an organization-wide approach to early childhood development that really envisions a world where all children, young children, survive, grow, and develop through policies, programs, and parenting practices that support child survival and optimal growth and development. But as importantly, we also recognize early childhood development as an outcome, something, and Professor Raphael mentioned that all sectors, so education, health, nutrition, contribute to, and all these require strong systems and multi-sectoral collaboration. In 2023, with our partners, we've been able to reach 450 million young children through those platforms that I just mentioned in both development and emergency contexts. Now, let's look at maybe make the transition from the nurturing care framework to the specific education sector and the specific contribution of early learning and pre-primary education in the broader early childhood development landscape. So going back to the NCF, maybe what we want to really take out of that is that we need to look at learning, think about learning along the 0 to 8 continuum, because as mentioned, learning starts at home and it evolves until the child is introduced to pre-primary education, which is an initial stage of organized instruction, but that provides the bridge between home and school. Hence, the critical role of parents parents have to play in this equation, because they have to be there for the child, they have to engage with the child, they have to communicate with the child, they have to ensure that the child stops learning at home until that transition is made to school, primary education. And this is why we made in the vision, we made parenting a critical pillar of the vision. And it's been mentioned, access to early learning education and pre-primary education, access to early learning and pre-primary education are really important because of all the elements of science that have been shared before. So I'm not going to be going through that again, but just to mention that it is bound to contribute to the learning, to address the learning crisis And I'm having issue with this thing again. Yeah, thank you. I should have been there with you guys. It would have been much easier. To the learning crisis, because as we have been saying, in many countries we see, in many regions of the world, the numbers of children going to school, access has improved, definitely. But do children actually learn when they go to school? Are the learning outcomes better? Not necessarily, and this is why we are referring to this learning crisis that COVID has unfortunately worsened, so much so that now we're even talking about learning poverty, with 53% of children in low and middle income countries not being able to read and understand a simple story by the end of primary school, according to UNESCO. And this is bound to become even worse if you're looking at the increasing number of emergencies that cause children to drop out of school, because once they drop out of school, the chance that they return are low, and once they fall behind, they will rarely catch up with their peers. But of course, there are good news. When there are bad news, there are good news, and the good news is that early learning and development are integral to recovery and remediation. And I can share here a couple of examples quickly so that we can get to the next speaker. So how? We can see from data, from evidence, that children who attend quality preschool programs will start primary school with a solid foundation for learning because they have stronger social skills, they have larger vocabularies, better number sets, more curiosity, they're able to communicate better, they have better social emotional learning. In other words, they are better prepared to engage in school, to learn, to remain in school. And we have also seen that countries with national higher attendance rates in early childhood education programs also have a significantly higher percentage of children who are developmentally on track, both in overall development, but also in emergent literacy and numeracy skills, and this regardless of their country's income status and overall levels of support for learning at home. And because repetition and dropout rates are bound to be lower, pre-primary education, access to pre-primary education also makes education systems more efficient and effective. But now, we know it's good, we know that this is what we want, but what is actually the situation out there? Unfortunately, we can see that we have many millions of children, 175 million children out there, about half of pre-primary age children globally who are not enrolled in pre-primary education, and of course, needless to say, they miss a critical window of opportunity, an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to be ready for school, an opportunity to remain in school, an opportunity to become productive citizens. And this is, I already mentioned it quickly because the numbers are quite striking, but just to say that children living in emergency are particularly affected. UNICEF has estimated that 23% of pre-primary age children worldwide live in the 33 countries affected by emergencies, and that represents nearly 82 million pre-primary age children who are affected by instability and are at risk of toxic stress when we know how bad toxic stress can be for children's development. And these are the children, if you think about it, who actually need support the most, but who are actually missing on those opportunities. And this last slide before I conclude is really to show the urgency to accelerate efforts in order to provide universal access to pre-primary education, particularly for low and lower middle income countries, because at the current pace of progress, gross enrollment rates in pre-primary education in low income countries will only average 32% by 2030, compared to an estimated 86% in high income countries, when in the end the objective is for all countries to reach 100%. So, needless to say, business as usual is not going to be working, is not going to help us fulfill the promise of universal pre-primary education. And just a few recommendations. So when I want to conclude, just to say that it means that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. Those countries who are behind will have to invest much more money, much more energy in order to be able to play catch-up. There is a standard that has been, a benchmark that has been established at 10%, but for those countries that are lagging behind, probably investment will have to be much higher. We have to use a twin-track approach in the sense that, yes, we can have separate preschool services, but also have to think about integrating in financing mechanisms, support financing for preschool services and for early learning. So we need to boost not only domestic financing, but also find a way to have access to innovating financing. But at last but not least, there is money out there. The question is also, how do we make more efficient and equitable use of those resources? And let me stop here and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Irina, and thank you for your patience also with the technology. Our train is moving, so we've talked about the first 1,000 days, we've talked about the next 1,000 days being the next best opportunity, and now we've honed in on early childhood education, what it takes, how behind we are, but how there are quick wins that can be made based on commitment, financing, and again, layering those supports to mother, families, communities, schools, and ensuring that everyone has the capacity to be able to do what they need to do. We'll conclude now with our last speaker, Dr. Amanda De Vercelli. She's our Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank and Program Manager for the World Bank's Early Learning Partnership. She currently leads the bank's Invest in Childcare initiative and is currently supporting 70+ countries to scale up access to quality, affordable childcare to support women's economic empowerment. She's been with the bank for over 15 years and leads their operational and analytical work across multiple countries, including Morocco. She will now conclude in helping us to understand what it takes to invest in early childhood education and what the cost of inaction looks like in terms of its impact. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bonjour, merci. Je vais essayer de faire cette présentation en français. So on va voir si c'est une bonne idée ou non. C'est un grand plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. C'est un plaisir de voir des amis de longue date venus de ton pays différents. Merci du Royaume de Maroc, UNICEF et le ministère de l'Éducation nationale, du préscolaire et du sport. Il est tout à fait approprié que nous soyons ici au Maroc pour cette importante conférence. En effet, au cours des 5 dernières années, nous avons assisté à une augmentation sans précédent de l'accès à un enseignant préscolaire de qualité ici au Maroc. J'adresse mes sincères félicitations au Royaume du Maroc pour ce progrès incroyable. Un grand nombre des sujets dont nous discuterons au cours des prochains jours se concrétisent ici de manière efficace au Maroc. La coordination entre les secteurs pour améliorer le développement de l'enfant, l'engagement des parents, l'accent sur la qualité, la formation et la mesure de l'impact, l'engagement des collectivités territoriales et le partenariat public-privé entre le ministère de l'Éducation, l'INDH, les fondations comme la Fondation Marocaine du préscolaire et la Fondation Zachora et d'autres. Tout cela est en train de passer ici au Maroc. Aujourd'hui, je vais diviser ma présentation dans les 3 parties que vous voyez. Commençons donc par la section 1. Dans cette diapositive, je vous montre les résultats de l'examen PISA qui teste les enfants à l'âge de 15 ans dans le monde entier, presque entier. Les données que je vous montre proviennent de 65 pays. Lorsque nous avons analysé le lien entre l'éducation préscolaire et l'amélioration des résultats, nous avons constaté que dans 63 sur 65 pays, il existe une association positive, statistiquement significative, entre l'éducation de la petite enfance et les résultats ultérieurs en tenant compte des variations si nécessaire. 63 de 65 pays, on voit ces résultats. À droite, vous voyez les résultats des enfants qui ont suivi un programme d'éducation préscolaire pendant moins d'1 an, comparé à ceux des enfants qui n'ont pas suivi de programme d'éducation préscolaire. Le bleu foncé correspond aux mathématiques et le bleu clair, c'est la lecture. Ce que vous voyez, c'est que les enfants qui ont bénéficié d'une éducation préscolaire ont tendance à obtenir des résultats supérieurs de plus de 40 points en mathématiques et de 34 points en lecture par rapport aux enfants qui n'ont pas suivi de l'éducation préscolaire. Cela équivaut à une année complète de scolarité en plus. Regardons ensuite à gauche les résultats des enfants qui ont suivi un programme d'éducation préscolaire pendant plus d'1 an, plus de temps avec le préscolaire. Les résultats sont identiques, mais encore plus forts, plus marqués. Plus de 82 points de plus en mathématiques et plus de 66 points de plus en lecture. Cela équivaut à 2,75 années de scolarité supplémentaire. OK. Maintenant, passons à la section 2. Et ici, je vais vous montrer un peu d'une histoire. Je vais essayer de faire ça. Sur ce graphique, nous examinons les données de 40 pays à revenus faibles ou moyens. Nous examinons le taux d'inscription par rapport au nombre d'enfants dans une tranche d'âge. La ligne bleue qui traverse le graphique montre que le ratio devrait être égal, le même nombre d'enfants inscrits que le nombre d'enfants ayant l'âge requis pour cette classe. Les lignes grises sont les lignes de pays individuelles et la ligne turquoise montre la tendance médiane dans les pays. Ce que vous voyez, c'est que dans les 40 pays, dans les premières années du primaire, les classes 1, classe 2, classe 3, il y a beaucoup plus d'enfants inscrits dans ces classes qu'il ne devrait y en avoir. Il s'agit d'une surinscription. Puis, dans les dernières années du primaire, 5e et 6e année, il y a 2 fois moins d'enfants. Il y a eu des abandons. Cette surscolarisation dans les premières années du primaire coûte au pays des milliards de ressources mal allouées. Et dans de nombreux pays, la sous-scolarisation en première année peut coûter 5% du budget total de l'éducation par an. Et maintenant, prenons l'exemple du Rwanda. Et j'espère que ça marche. Essayez de rester avec moi. Il s'agit des chiffres et des statistiques budgétaires réelles datant de quelques années. OK, ce que vous voyez, c'est nous commençons avec le budget d'éducation. L'école primaire reçoit 34% de le budget d'éducation au Rwanda. OK, nous prenons ces 43% et nous venons au milieu de la slide. Le budget de l'enseignant primaire. La première année reçoit 28% du budget de l'enseignant primaire, là-bas. Maintenant, nous prenons cette 28% de la première année, mais si nous voyons les effectifs de la première année, 56 des inscriptions en la première année sont en sous-nombre. Ce sont des enfants qui ne doivent pas être dans cette classe. Et comme on va voir dans les prochaines slides, il refait. OK? So, en total, ça c'est 5% par année de le budget de l'éducation qui est perdu. Et ça c'est une tendance qu'on voit dans tous les 40 pays que nous avons analysés. OK, so qu'est-ce qui explique ce phénomène? Il y a 4 facteurs qui influencent l'apprentissage des enfants et l'efficacité du système dans les 5 premières années d'apprentissage fondamental. Les 4 sont l'inscription en première année par rapport à l'âge de la population appropriée, le taux d'inscription en deuxième année par rapport au taux d'inscription en première année, le taux brut d'inscription dans les préscolaires et le taux brut d'admission en première année. Ici, vous voyez les tendances, les lignes là en couleur, ce sont comment ces 4 facteurs bougent ensemble. Sur la droite, vous voyez les pays les plus performants dans le monde, dans l'éducation. À gauche, vous voyez les pays les moins performants. Okay? Et ce que vous voyez, c'est que les pays les plus performants ont les 4 facteurs plus proches. Cette combinaison des 4 facteurs aux couleurs au cours des 5 premières années d'école explique 34% de la variance des taux d'achievement des études dans les différents pays, ce qui est plus important que les dépenses par élève. Ça, c'est incroyable. Indique que ces facteurs sont responsables d'une grande partie de l'inefficacité interne des systèmes éducatifs. OK. J'espère que vous êtes un peu convaincus sur le problème. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? On voit beaucoup de choses qu'on peut faire ici en train d'être faites au Maroc. Je vais vous montrer un exemple au Pérou. C'est le pays de mon mari. C'est un bon pays, j'espère que vous pouvez le visiter un jour. Ici, nous voyons les statistiques dans l'année 1995. Et ce que vous voyez, c'est la surscolarisation massive dans les premières années du primaire. Vous voyez la couleur orange, et ça c'est le nombre d'enfants, et la couleur bleue, c'est le nombre d'enfants que nous devons voir. Okay? Et ce triangle, c'est la surscolarisation. Pérou a vu le problème, ils ont introduit quelques réformes. Premièrement, les finances. Les dépenses publiques de l'éducation sont passées de 3,4% à 3,9%. L'augmentation de la couverture, le taux d'inscription dans l'enseignement préscolaire est passé de 35% à 99% entre les 20 années ici. L'équité, objectif d'atteindre une couverture préscolaire de 100% pour les enfants des districts les plus pauvres situés dans les zones rurales et indigènes. Même la qualité, loi sur la carrière des enseignants, trajectoire de développement professionnel basée sur le mérite, augmentation des salaires. Il y a le plan de réforme des enseignants, plan de carrière, formation des enseignants, système d'incitation et une diversité de l'offre de services. Visite à domicile, programme communautaire, préscolaire, garde d'enfants. Il y a toutes les options pour toutes les familles. OK, vous êtes prêts pour les résultats? Et voilà. Il n'y a pas plus de triangle. OK? À 2015, on voit que le nombre d'enfants qui doit être dans chaque classe est presque ce qui est dans chaque classe. OK? On voit que l'inefficacité, c'était vraiment à régler dans 20 années. Ça prend du temps, mais ça, c'est incroyable. Les résultats, le redoublement en première année a diminué de 27% à 1% dans ces 20 années. Le taux d'achèvement du cycle primaire est passé de 63% à 96%. Et de 20% à 88% dans les districts les plus pauvres. Même comme ici au Maroc, un focus sur les districts ruraux et pauvres. Et voilà, les 4 lignes se bougent plus ensemble dans les 20 années. Mais que s'est passé d'autre au Pérou pendant ces années? Ce n'était pas juste l'éducation. Il y a une réduction sans précédent du retard de croissance, réduire de 31% jusqu'à 13%, rationalisation de l'enregistrement des naissances et d'autres processus gouvernementaux clés pour faciliter l'accès aux services, mécanisme de transfert de fonds au niveau local et amélioration de la collecte et de l'utilisation de données au niveau local. Je pense que je n'ai pas beaucoup de temps qui reste, je ne veux pas lire tous les facteurs ici, mais ce sont des choses que nous savons sont très importantes. La qualité, équité, coordination multisectorielle, engagement des parents, données, le mesurement, tout ça, le leadership. Il y a beaucoup de choses ensemble qui ont réussi au Pérou et qui sont en train de réussir ici au Maroc. Je vais conclure avec ma troisième section. Et ça, c'est que l'investissement dans la petite enfance est essentiel pour atteindre des objectifs de développement plus larges, notamment l'émancipation économique des femmes. La garde d'enfants, c'est une situation, à mon pays, nous disons gagnant, 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 gagnant. L'accès à des services de garde d'enfants de qualité peut permettre de sortir de la pauvreté, de développer le capital humain et d'accroître l'équité. Ce sont les pierres angulaires de la croissance économique et de la productivité d'un pays. Nous voyons un meilleur emploi des femmes, bien-être familial accru, meilleurs résultats en termes de développement de petite enfance. Mes yeux, je suis un peu âgée. Et productivité et croissance économique accrue. OK, je vais terminer avec quelques numéros et un autre exemple du pays. OK, sur les trois chiffres que je voudrais présenter. 606 millions. C'est le nombre de femmes qui ne font pas partie de la population active en raison de leur responsabilité familiale. Et ce nombre de hommes, vous pensez, c'est plus grand ou plus petit? C'est 41 millions, beaucoup plus petit. 350 millions. Ça, c'est le nombre d'enfants de moins de 6 ans qui, selon nos estimations, ont besoin de structures d'accueil, mais n'ont pas accès. Cela représente plus de 40% des enfants de cette tranche d'âge dans tout le monde. Et enfin, 2 à 4%. Ça, c'est l'augmentation moyenne de la participation des femmes au marché du travail après l'adoption par les pays de loi sur la garde d'enfants. Ce chiffre provient d'une analyse de 195 pays effectuée par la Banque mondiale dans l'indice Women Business and the Law. Et pour terminer, je veux terminer avec un exemple d'un pays ici en Afrique. Le RDC, c'est un programme que la Banque mondiale a travaillé avec le gouvernement RDC qui a impacté sur l'autonomisation économique des femmes et le développement des enfants. Donne-moi un instant, je vais chercher exactement les détails. Mais c'était une intervention au niveau communautaire dans le secteur agricole et ils ont travaillé avec des groupes de femmes d'organiser des crèches communautaires et ils ont fait une évaluation d'impact. Et ce qu'ils ont vu, ce sont des impacts pour des femmes, pour des hommes, pour des familles et pour des enfants. Et c'était un programme qui n'est pas très coûteux. Comme ma collègue a dit, le coût n'est pas cher. Et ce que nous pouvons gagner, ce que les enfants, les femmes, les familles, les businesses, tous nous pouvons gagner, c'est vraiment beaucoup plus que les coûts. Et si on peut le faire dans RDC, dans une zone rurale, on peut le faire partout. Et maintenant, 2 années après l'intervention, après le financement, les crèches continuent. Parce qu'ils représentent un service essentiel aux communautés et les familles ont décidé de continuer de payer lui-même pour ce service essentiel. Et maintenant, la Banque mondiale est en train de travailler avec le secteur agricole d'aller à l'échelle beaucoup plus à RDC. Alors, je voudrais vous laisser là. Merci beaucoup pour votre patience et attention. Merci.
Thank you very much for that last presentation, which brings us back a bit to the messages that we received at the beginning. How this is truly the work of everybody. It involves parents, it involves communities, it involves decision makers, those with budgets, for reminding us how the cost of quality access to early childhood education far outweighs, is far less than the benefits that we accrue over time, how every year reaps new dividends that will be felt for a lifetime, how ultimately, when all is said and done for all these presentations, we recognize that yes, there are benefits to our economies, there are benefits to social cohesion, there are benefits to the economic empowerment of women, but ultimately we're fulfilling the rights of every child who deserves the opportunity to thrive, firstly to survive well, nutrition, brain development, for us to recognize how much impact we can have with each month, day at the very outset, and how this investment makes such a difference through the life cycle of that child, adolescent, and onwards. Thank you to all our speakers for reminding us of the new second 1,000 days, which kind of leverage the autonomy of the child and the growing capacities of the child, but bring in new dimensions, obviously, like we see with climate change and pollution and all other kinds of things we need to be thinking about. To Dr. Dia for reminding us that these are commitments we have taken. These are not ad hoc commitments. They are promises that we have made and that we need to respond to very quickly. Indeed, the nurturing framework gives us an opportunity to do that, but each of our speakers have drilled down on how early learning presents a particularly critical window for all of our care and attention. I want to conclude by bringing back what our speaker said in the beginning about how we did see some examples. All the speakers talked about how Morocco is one of those examples where we can see of this effort of generalization and of multiple partnerships coming together, public, private, parents, communities, central actors, regional actors. This is something that we hope to continue to share over the course of the next 2 days, but we'd like to hear from all of you, like the example that we heard from RDC, of other things that could be done. And to conclude with something that Dr. Draper told us about how these stories from these countries need to be shared, documented, evaluated, and published so that the dominance of the research and evidence that we have is not simply from high-income countries, but really from countries that look like the countries in which we operate. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a dense afternoon, but hopefully just the information we needed to help us over the next 2 days to share experiences, to go through all of the pillars that are necessary for effective early childhood education, from governance, from curricular, to trainings, to policies, so that we can then slowly craft together a partnership that helps us to continue to learn from each other and to meet these targets that we've all committed to. So thank you very much to our esteemed guests for starting us so well in the beginning, for why the stakes are so high and why the onus is on all of us to act now. Thank you for your attention. There's a coffee break and then we'll come back for the next session. Thank you again.